My name is Denise DeLucia. I'm the education specialist at Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls, New York. I'm sitting in the historic kitchen of the Seneca Falls Historical Society. I have with me today Allison Horrocks from Lowell National Historical Park in Lowell, Massachusetts. So today we're going to talk about the domestic life of women, the public life of women, and the role of women in the industrial world. Tell me a little bit about where you're at today, Allison.
I am coming to you today from Lowell, Massachusetts, and I am sitting in one part of a historic boarding house. So we are in a structure that originally would have housed several units of women who had come to Lowell to find industrial work in factories. And so the boarding house system started in the 1820s in Lowell as a way to provide residences for these new workers in the factory world. And I am sitting here today in the kitchen portion of it. And just off screen, I am joined by the view of a boarding housekeeper. She's the person who would actually do all the very hard work on this stove. For scale, this is actually not very big. This stove right here would be used to feed anywhere between 24 and 40 women who were coming from farms where their mothers usually cooked for them. So women who were accustomed to being part of that system of domestic life, domestic work, they'd come to Lowell and they'd work really hard days in factories, but probably for the first time in their lives as working class women, other people cooked for them 3 meals a day. Now, you're also sitting here next to a stove.
I am.
And we're using these today to talk about entry points into women's lives.
Right.
So the kind of work that they do, what's important about them. You're going to hear me talking about mill girls, and we're actually talking about people who are mostly women. So they're not really actually very young, but they call themselves mill girls because it was a temporary job that they took. And a lot of them call themselves mill girls, even if they were 25 or 30, or on the verge of elderly, like me, 32 in the 1840s. And they called themselves girls because many of them had plans to leave, start a household of their own by marrying a man and to enter womanhood and kind of leave that girlhood of being a factory girl. So as we talk about these topics today, we're talking about food and we're talking about stoves, but really as a way to understand how people ordered their lives. And Denise, can you kind of tell us more about how you use this domestic history to do women's history in Seneca Falls?
Sure. So one of the stories we're tasked with telling is the story of the Seneca Falls 1848 convention. One of the women who spearheaded that convention is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she lived right here in Seneca Falls for about 16 years. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a woman of privilege. She had a very large yard, lots of lawn, lots of places for all of her children to play, but she also had gardens and a pretty large orchard. She had one woman who was her housekeeper for about 30 years. And then she would bring in other help here and there to help with the cooking and help with the children. But that was really how she entered the world of domestic life. Elizabeth Stanton loved being a mom, but she didn't love that that was her only option. When she began to fight for women's rights, she started to talk about women of privilege and women of means, because she felt like if she spoke about women of means with everything that they had available to them and everything that they had, their education and their money and their status in their town and their society, they still were subject to the men in their life, whether it be their husband or their father or even a brother, if that was to happen. So as she moved from domestic life and motherhood into this huge public sphere that she came to be known for, you know, she really struggled with the idea of the balance of domestic responsibility. So even if she was able to go out and have all these conversations and do all these speeches and attend all these conferences, there was still somebody, you know, it wasn't the burden of her husband to pick up the slack, would be right? It was the burden of the help that she had in her home. But that also didn't, you know, that was really difficult for her too. She said in a letter in the 1850s, the late 1850s, one of her domestic helpers was leaving to go get work in a mill, possibly one of the woolen mills that were, you know, kind of dotted the landscape around here, just as the cotton mills did in Lowell. Elizabeth said, you know, she didn't blame this young woman. Said, I can't blame her for being tired of revolving around the cook stove. You know, that's really, you know, her connection to the domestic sphere, really from a role of a privileged woman. I understand that's not really the case for the young women or the mill girls in Lowell.
No, these are mostly people in those early decades who are coming from nearby farms. So they're being recruited and they're moving to Lowell, and they don't tend to be people who are deeply impoverished. They're people whose families can spare them to go to Lowell, but they're also usually from families where affording a sizable sort of monetary package for their wedding would be hard. So going to Lowell is one way to do that. These are also people living through times of tremendous social upheaval, which I think is very familiar to us in a new way right now. Particularly the women of the 1840s, there are a lot more people who are immigrating to the United States. So communities are changing in that way. There's also a range of social movements happening in the 1840s, which you're going to tell us about, and that also come to Lowell. But part of what is compounding everything else in their lives is this thing behind me. For generations, women were learning how to do domestic tasks together. They were training together, learning together, and often it was in front of a hearth. Or in the case of enslaved women, they were also trained by other people in their lives, but forced to do that labor. In Lowell, the time of the Industrial Revolution, when people start moving to these boarding houses, is the advent of this kind of cook stove. And so everything you might have learned about how to cook in front of a hearth or using other forms of technology, it's no good. You have to learn how to do this entirely differently. Now, you have some great stories about what's happening in terms of this change and this upheaval in the 1840s, not the least of which, of course, is the convention that women host in Seneca Falls.
Yeah, so in 1848, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 4 other women from this area, well, most of them from this area, initiated the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights. And in there, they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which was, you know, based on the Declaration of Independence. It had a list of grievances very similar to that of the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, in there was full suffrage for women, the right to divorce, the right to own property, the rights to an education, the rights to facilitate and participate in religious activities. All of those things in 1848 weren't afforded to women. You know, Elizabeth had a neighbor whose husband was in the legislature. He was away a lot, working for the region, and she wanted a new stove, but her husband was away. And Elizabeth convinced her to buy the stove even without her husband. And then when he gets home, he's like, what's this, you know, what's this big beautiful stove doing here? And it took a little while, you know, for him to really understand that it was okay. And it wasn't until, probably many years later, she also became pretty active in the women's rights movement of the moment. And her husband said, I think I like her better this way. I think she's pretty cool this way. But it all started with the stove, but really it was really the purchasing power and the ability of her to purchase that stove without permission from her husband. Those are things that today we don't even really consider, right, as something that is that important, that a woman needed a new stove and was encouraged to do so. Yeah, that's a fun little story about Elizabeth. So what's happening in Lowell with some of these young women, and how is their independence changing in the 1840s? What effects are they feeling from any of these social reform movements that are happening?
Yeah, so in some ways, women working in Lowell, they're responding to social reform movements, things like the push for bloomers and dress reform, they're picking that up. And in other ways, they're really leading some social reform, particularly in terms of the working class movement. So this space that I'm in right now, which is a boarding house, would have been really kind of a strange thing to a lot of people who were used to rural life or life on a farm. Before Lowell had boarding houses and factories, it was a small cluster of sundry farms, right? So places where people grew a variety of things and lived in farmhouses. If you were a young woman who came to Lowell, say early 1840s, you lived with peers, you lived with other young women in your peer group, and you lived under the supervision of a boarding house keeper, usually a woman a bit older than you, or possibly a widow. And they have something that I think we all still understand is very precious, which is time where they're not working, so they're not beholden to the bells of a factory, and time when they don't have to do domestic labor or care work for other people. This might only be 3 hours a day, but if you think of your own life, how much time is really truly your own every day? Really hard to carve that out for a variety of reasons. So women coming from these farming communities where they're expected to work very seasonally, but very intensively with the family, at night, after they have their last meal of the day cooked by a boarding house keeper, they have time. This is where you start to see the movement for petitions for shorter working days. This is where you see movements for walkouts, for demanding worker rights. And I don't think that would be happening if they didn't have this space carved out together. They're able to kind of form an awareness with each other of an identity as working women. And that's when you start to see people pushing that mill girl label right back, right? Are you more inclined to listen to a factory working woman's push for rights or a mill girl? If you think of them as factory workers, you kind of have to listen to them a little bit more. So that's where the mill girl kind of does double work. Women were also joining cooperatives, very similar to what you might find in a city today, where they're trying to cut out middlemen to get better, cheaper produce to supply kitchens like ones of a boarding house. Sarah Bagley, who's a very big labor rights activist who actually moves to New York after she works in Lowell, is one of the people who pushes for these co-ops to make clean, fresh, good, vital foods easier to supply to these boarding housekeepers, feeding the women.
So what kind of foods would they have eaten?
Yeah, so one of the things that they would eat for breakfast, which young visitors are always especially interested in, is apple pie. And they are actually eating some pretty sizable meals. And part of that is eating in the factories is really not just discouraged, it's outlawed. So you're not seeing the kind of pan-toting that you might see in later years. There's no luncheonettes yet, there's no diners, those are coming later. They're eating 3 heavy meals into their workday. They start work, they have a very heavy breakfast with things like cod balls, apple pie, they might have squash. for some women coming from vulnerable circumstances, or particularly Irish laborers who come to the city in the 1840s, the availability and consistency of food would have really been a shock to some people, or a new experience. And these places also really depended on Irish labor, Irish women who came in and worked really as a supplement in the kitchen, because boarding housekeepers were making these massive family style meals 3 times a day. But I always say it's very heavy carb. They wouldn't have understood it that way, but very heavy carb, lots of coffee, not a lot of water. So we would understand them today as kind of carved up and dehydrated.
Okay. I don't know if we talked about this, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, very often her domestic help were young Irish immigrant women. And I remember reading that she said that, once they learned the language and gained some skills and gained some knowledge of the new place that they were living, they moved on to, bigger, brighter futures. And she seemed pretty, pretty supportive of that for them. So what was the difference in the life of a woman? So like after a young woman worked in the mill, what were her prospects after that?
Mm-hmm. So Thomas Dublin has done a lot of long, extensive work on this, and part of what he finds is they are still very likely to marry, and to marry a man, but they are more likely to marry a man who's worked in a trade outside of farming, or who lives in a city. They themselves are also more likely to live in a city. And there's there's something that happens, right, to a person who has this type of experience. Once they become a wage earner as a woman, once they've opened a bank account as a woman, a lot of these people are really changed by that experience. I think they're more likely to be active in certain kinds of causes, not necessarily suffrage, but we see really high rates of women enroll giving money to causes such as abolition. They're more likely to sign petitions, I would say, than people in a farming community, one town over. Most people did this work temporarily and moved on. They took whatever money they made. But you do see some of those, again, kind of long-standing changes of they are very much less likely to just go back to life on a farm. And that was really the fear. That was the fear that if women earned money that they could hold in their hands and deposit in their bank account, would women still want to do what they were increasingly understanding as unpaid labor for men and dependents? And in some cases, the answer is no. Some people do stay in the boarding house system for a long time. It really does change people in that way. And that was a very big social fear. Orestes Bronson writes a very long article about, whether factory work really kind of taints a woman forever.
Wow.
Whether these women are still people that you should marry. And when you think of that experience of having that precious time to yourself in the evening, for some women it was short-lived, but of course having access to libraries, having access to your own bank account, that's certainly going to change you.
It certainly causes a certain amount of independence. But what you were just talking about, Allison, about, are these women still suitable for a marriage after they work in the mills? Reminds me of one of the, at the park in our exhibits, we have some anti-suffrage memorabilia. And what you just said really reminded me of some of the postcards and posters for the anti-suffrage campaigns in the early part of the 20th century. And one in particular, there's a gentleman standing by the stove holding a baby and stirring a pot, and the caption reads, and I'm paraphrasing, but the caption reads, what's next for him if she gets the vote, or some such thing. But so, here we are with, in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and then also again in, the first 20 years of the the 20th century, 50, 60, 70 years later, and it's still the same question. Like, are these women who work in industry still suitable to be domestic for men? Questions of domesticity and working outside the home, really up even until my time when I was having, raising my son. The question of working in the home and out of the home was still posed to women. So what do you say we make a pie?
I would love to do that. And I think in the grand tradition of being a mill girl, I will watch while you cook.
Oh, that's a good idea. And so are you familiar with Lydia Maria Child's cookbook, The Frugal Housewife?
Yes, Lydia Maria Child was a favorite author of Women in Wool.
Oh, she was. Oh, yeah, let's make a pie.